As a matter of fact, when Generation Zers are being interviewed and asked what is it that they look for in an employer, one of the first things they will answer is that they are technologically innovative, that they are willing to disrupt themselves from the inside and out.
Welcome to the TalentGrow Show, where you can get actionable, results-oriented insight and advice on how to take your leadership, communication, and people skills to the next level and become the kind of leader people want to follow. And now, your host and leadership development strategist, Halelly Azulay.
Welcome back, Talent Growers. This is Halelly Azulay here on the TalentGrow Show. I'm your leadership development strategist, and this is an episode that deals with the future and with the youngest generation that is entering the workforce, Gen Z. We talk about generations a lot. Well, I'm not in the show. We have talked about it. And episode 53 was all about generational differences. And recently we talked about it when we talked to Alexandra Levitt. And this week we have a guest who is also a futurist and an expert in Gen Z. And Boysen, she's going to talk to us about what are some of the trends that she's seeing from her research for this generation? What are some of their key characteristics that differentiate them? What does being a digital native really mean? And how they're preparing for their future and how to prepare for you as their leader or as someone in an organization that is going to be taking in more and more of them into the near future. So I hope that you'll enjoy this episode and let me know what you thought about it afterwards. Here we go. Talent Growers, this week we have Ann Boysen, the founder of After the Millennials, the first consultant service and blog designated specifically to understanding our youngest generation and the future they will shape and be shaped by. Using a bespoke approach adapted from strategic foresight, content analysis, and data analytics, Ann dives deep into trend spotting, social statistics, and data mining to advise businesses and nonprofits on how to act on early signs of change. She shares her insights as an advisor and via consulting projects and keynotes around the world. She holds a master's in Futurist studies from University in Houston and has additional graduate level education in business analytics and data mining from Colorado State University and Penn State University. And welcome to the TalentGrow Show.
Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure, and I'm so glad you stopped by because this is a fascinating topic that pops up so much. Before we start to dive into it, I always ask my guests to describe their professional journey. Where did you start, and how did you end up where you are today, briefly?
I did not set out to become a generational expert or a generational researcher. It's something that it's the product of many different backgrounds that I have. In the early 2000s, I came up with a master's degree in future studies of all things. It's like a lot of times you tell people you're a futurist and they go, yeah, I'm a futurist too. And, and it's like, yeah, everybody can be a futurist, but it is actually a program called Future Studies. So I came up with this degree. And so people will ask me things like, what do you foresee? What do you think is the next trend? What is the next technology? What is going to happen in the future? And obviously I can't predict any more than anybody else can. I can sort of help set the agenda on how we can think critically about the future. But one thing that became very clear to me was that we had this confluence of many different trends that would make our next generation live a very different life experiences than we had back, millennials and the generations before millennials. Mm-hmm. This is what prompted me to look a little bit more deeply into generational trends, specifically with an eye to this generation, because almost everything in that environment was going to be disrupted. And fair enough, we had 9/11. We started to see some effects of changing climates. We had a huge recession during those childhood years of Generation Z. And we had exponential growth in different types of technology. So all of a sudden, you didn't have to physically turn on a TV station in your living room. You could actually hold it in your hand and you could have access to the whole world. Yeah. So there was a lot of things that happened that really changed the foundational experiences of this generation. So that's how I got interested in this.
It's pretty cool. And yeah, you don't talk to a lot of people who are professional futurists. So that's always fascinating. You do a lot of research, right? I mean, the information that you bring to the audiences and the companies that you consult come from data that you found in the trends and the data that you are studying. And I definitely would love to hear, what are some of the data that you're studying? Where does it come from? And what are the trends that you're seeing that differentiates this generation, which some people I know call Generation Z, some people call them next gen, but this generation after the millennials, and maybe even give us the years of like their birth years or something, just so we can have a reference point. What's different about them?
Generational differences are not really set in stone. It's not physical science. So when some people come and say, okay, I'm Generation Z, I was born in 1994, they're not technically wrong. It's just some people disagree necessarily exactly where those cutoffs are. So most companies, I think the Generation Z being the generation born after 1995, around that area. Some people will say 1997, some people say 2000s. And then we have a very young generation called Generation Alpha, and they're born after 2010.
Okay.
And so it's not set in stone. And obviously, it's not like somebody, you have a newborn baby on the 1st of January of 1995, and all of a sudden they look completely different.
Yeah, right. Magically different when they're apart. Yeah.
Yeah.
True. It's pretty arbitrary.
It absolutely is. But that makes it even more important to be very careful about how we get data and how we analyze that data, precisely because we can't really refer to the laws of physics, and we can't refer to a lot of preconceived understandings about how things should work. Humans are different. We are idiosyncratic. We have all sorts of variables that influence how we think and what we do. So obviously there's going to be a lot of different variables that make people different. It's not just generational. That is just one of the many variables that make us different. So the way that I go about getting my research is I do have a theoretical framework. I believe that the most famous theoreticians or thinkers in this field were William Strauss and Neil Howe. They were historians, and they had cataloged generational change almost going like 500 years back and looking at these cycles of how different generational archetypes, it had almost like a cyclical nature. So you would have, over the course of a lifetime, you would have the onset of 4 different generations born into windows of 20 years. And then you would start seeing many of the traits that the oldest generation had possessed. You would start seeing some of those traits being reproduced in the youngest generation. When you really think about it, you could say maybe perhaps history does not repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. So, if you look at things like the last recession, it was about 80 years before then we had the Great Depression. Now, these experiences, when you're a child and you experience something like that, it's going to have an effect on you. It's going to have an effect on how you perceive the world, what you want to do with your life, how you want to make a change in this world. What we're seeing with this generation that is coming of age now, the theory goes that they're going to have a lot in common with that generation that was born into the 1930s, the ones that were experiencing the Second World War.
The traditionalists, is that what that generation is called? Yeah.
Yeah, the traditionalists. There's sometimes called the silent generation, sometimes called the traditionalists. And it's very interesting because, again, we can't take a theory at face value unless we also have the data and the empirical evidence that substantiate it.
Right.
And so it's very interesting to kind of see that a lot of the traits that we did indeed see with that generation in the 30s, we kind of see a little bit of the same mindset coming back. For example, growing up in a recessionary economy has made this youngest generation very risk averse. If you look at my generation when we were kids, you put money in our hands, we would go out and burn it. We'd go buy, big branded clothes, the fashionable crocodile on a t-shirt, or, you wanted to display sort of that you could afford to buy the nicest things. For this generation, it's not so much about brands. For example, brands are struggling a little bit more with this generation because they are not really brand loyal. They will look for the best deal, and they will actually take pride in the fact that they can save money. Look at thrift stores. Look at how all of a sudden the hip thing is to go to thrift stores and be able to tell your friends how much money you were able to save, So that is an interesting thing. And then, so we see a lot of trends that go along with this experience of growing up in an ever increasing volatile world where you have to be mature beyond your years. You have to care about your money. You have to be careful not to spend money, because what could tomorrow bring, This American dream where you believe that in your future there's going to be automatically 2 cars in the driveway and a house with a picket fence. They don't believe in that anymore. They understand that may or may not happen. They have very different aspirations, very different ideas about what the future might look like.
The other thing that I've been hearing about this generation is we always say they're digital natives. And I know that that's something you have researched, the effects of that. And let's talk about that and define it.
Being native to something, I think especially when you hear the word digital native, it's very often you make this assumption that, they must be all about technology. They must be after the last shiny gadget. And that is true to a certain extent. But when you really think about what nativity to a culture really means, it doesn't mean that you are exuberant necessarily about that culture. It means more that you know this culture inside out. This is native to it. You have a sort of innate understanding, and almost instinctual understanding about how it works. So you're able to appreciate the ability of what is in that technology or culture or language which is native to you, but you're also appreciative to the downfalls. So if, for example, we think of Generation Zers today are fully aware that they have a little bit of a screen problem, Yeah. You typically see the kids just staring down at their screens. They actually do spend something like 9 hours a day on their screens, and 86% of them will actually admit that these might be a little problematic.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they also understand that technology is both, it might be a threat, but it's also the solution to a lot of the issues. Now, there's one worrisome trend that we're seeing is that young people are a lot more worried. I mentioned this about being worried about finances and being able to afford the necessities in life. We see, for example, there are now, a lot of kids that are starting talking about foregoing college because they looked at their millennial siblings and they noticed that, wow, they took up these huge student loans and then the recession happened and they never really being able to recuperate from that. So a lot of them are looking at many different solutions, and they're very solutionists. They're very concerned about finding solutions and maybe sometimes untraditional solutions. And so what we might see is that technology is a double-edged sword. Yeah, the digital technology, social media can take a little bit too much toll on them at the same time. Growing up with exponential technologies, knowing that we can get all of our energy from the sun, we're finally at a point where, storage capacity we're seeing the capabilities of being able to store photovoltaic energy to a point where we might not even need to use fossil fuels anymore. They care deeply about things like this. The possibility of growing meat in a lab versus having to slaughter millions of animals and with the effects that has on climate and water consumption and resource consumption. These are trends that concern this generation deeply. And I think we're going to see more of it as we move further into the future and we see that technology represents so many solutions. And so you see them embrace it more than reject it, I think. As a matter of fact, when Generation Zers are being interviewed and asked what is it that they look for in an employer, one of the first things they will answer is that they are technologically innovative, that they are willing to disrupt themselves from the inside and out.
Very interesting. What else are they looking for in terms of their careers or from their employer, from their leaders?
So I mentioned a little bit this about their risk awareness and their hesitation of taking student loans. Now, I don't think we should expect that the Generation Zers are typically going to forego college, because that in itself is a risk. So you have a risk going into college because you're going to get this huge student loan, as you don't even know if maybe 40% of the job tasks that they have been trained for might be taken over by computers. We don't even know that. So that is a risk in itself, but it's also a risk not to do it. So I think you will see young, ambitious people looking for alternative ways for career preparations. You'll see them do more online training, doing schools at home, which they can get it for free or for a tenth of the cost of going to university. I don't think that they look up to this Ivy League, perfect titles, this traditional route. So it's going to be more oriented around the end product of what they want to do and solve more than ending up with a nice degree.
This aligns well with what you were just describing, how they are solutionists and that they're not that interested in labels or in brands. Because I think that I have been following this trend about, potentially not going to university. And I have actually very strong opinions about this based on what I'm seeing. I no longer think that university degrees are at all returning on the investment that they require for most people, right? I mean, if you want to be a neurosurgeon, please go to college and study how to do it. But if you're going to be in the marketing department, you're probably just as well off to get an internship, an apprenticeship, and then learn things on the job and become job ready. And most employers are saying that people are coming into jobs from college who don't have any of the skills that they need, and they have to teach them everything from scratch anyway. But what I was going to say about the labels is that used to be that university would signal, like sort of put a label on you that says you're qualified, you're good, your goods are good. And now if these people don't really care about that, that makes sense. It aligns with them being maybe more willing to forgo it.
Yes, exactly. And I think we're going to see more of that. And I agree with you. And there are definitely educations that are tied to being able to have a license. You wouldn't have a surgeon work on you that doesn't have the credentials, but at the same time,
on the internet.
Yeah, exactly. But at the same time, we're also moving into a paradigm where surgery or being a surgeon is not only being a surgeon, it might also be able to manipulate robotics.
Right.
I mean, so you have technology entering fields that used to be very silos away from technological development. So I think this is another sort of blended approach that we see with this generation. Again, the fact that they're discarding labels, even labels when it comes to something so basic as gender. When you think of gender fluidity, they think of cultural fluidity. They don't consider themselves being boxed into any sort of pre-designated title for anything.
Interesting.
So with that mindset, I also think that we'll see young people find a goal, what they want to work with. Okay. And then there are tons of problems. And again, we're looking at a generation that is deeply worried about the future. And so there's tons of problems. And we talk about jobs disappearing to robots and computers. Yeah, that might be the jobs of today. When you look at these problems that need to be solved in this world, I think we'll see, the shift of jobs going and both aspirations, job titles, and orientations in general towards problems, maybe not designated as the object of one specific profession, but perhaps you'll have, let's say you have a young person who wants to solve a water crisis in a third world country. They might have to study a little bit of engineering. They might have to study a little bit of anthropology. They might have to come up with some business ideas on how to promote maybe they're working on a new type of equipment, app, platform, whatever, and it's going to take many different types of skills. And they're going to have to build these very agile teams to put it together and get it to market very quickly. And that is going to require a very different approach to learning than the typical traditional educational system, which was, by the way, created back in the agricultural era.
Right.
So,
it's so outmoded. Oh, that's just so interesting. Okay, good. So, and we know also that workplace trends are shifting towards creating micro organizations, right? So, big organizations can no longer just continue to work as this, large behemoths with silos and everybody working in these different departments, but rather creating these multifunctional micro teams that get together for projects and then break apart and get together again. I mean, this all comes together.
Yes. And I think that is a work style that is going to be far more conducive to a generation who has been labeled with an 8-second attention span, So being able to think, several decades ahead and think that I'm going to be stuck in this career path and I'm not going to look over my shoulder and see what's going on the other side. And I think that would be very unnatural to this generation. Yeah.
Interesting. So one thing I know that just from studying about generations in the past, and I have read Strauss and Howe's work and found it fascinating, is that when they were describing the silent generation or the traditionalists, if I remember correctly, they were very loyal and they, I guess they tended to stick with, or maybe it was just the industrial era employer-employee relationship, but they would kind of stick with one organization for a long time. And here, as you're describing their risk aversion similarity, but this workplace scenario does not really match that whole sticking with one organization for a long time.
Yeah, but I do think that could be where we see a little bit of conflicts of interest and contention in general, because on the one hand, they are risk averse. So most Gen Zers are going to be looking for a job that is going to help them receive a paycheck. I don't see them sort of embrace this gig economy where everybody's a freelancer and we're all just a happy family and you never know what you're going to do tomorrow. You don't know where the paycheck is going to come from tomorrow. I do think that they're going to want to see some sort of consistency. So I don't think the big legacy institutions are going to just wither away anytime soon. I think that they have a huge potential of generating a lot of interesting activities inside the organization, for example, by hiring these intrapreneurs, because being an entrepreneur carries a lot of risk with it. And when you're growing up risk averse, that might not necessarily be the first route that you're seeking out. But being intrapreneur, where you can be inside an organization and perhaps, like you said, create some of these micro-organizations, be project-oriented and bring some of that innovation inside the organization. I think that Generation Z will be very well suited to fill those type of positions.
Give us something that leaders can take away from this conversation, leaders and managers, that can help them leverage the strengths of this generation and this situation.
I do think that they need to empathize fully and holistically with this generation. I don't think it's enough to sort of, we're beyond the ping pong tables, okay. I mean, that's nice. It's nice if you have a cafeteria plan. It's nice if you have a ping pong table, but you're going to have to really empathize. This is not sort of like, I almost said, I don't mean to rag on any generation, but the happy-go-lucky millennials, that grew up with Barney and everything was sunshine. And I'm not saying that millennials are still happy-go-lucky, but there's a little bit more of a wariness with this generation that is coming of age now.
Interesting.
Yeah, they've been front-loaded with huge social issues very early in life. And so they want to make changes. They are not going to opt for status quo. They're going to want to see, both as consumers, as employees, and in the future as leaders, they're going to want to see organizations being willing to make a change and to help them change the world for a better place. Again, there's so much talk these days about how we have all these, what we call the VUCA threats, VUCA standing for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous.
Yeah.
There's a very strong sense of wanting to create some sort of certainty, some kind of more security in that environment. And so the organizations that are going to have some luck with this generation are the ones that can fully empathize with their vision of the future, not just the next quarter, the profit earnings for the next quarter, but actually take a huge and make some visionary investments in the future of Generation Z.
Yeah, so interesting, because it's this contradiction or this dichotomy between change, that they seek change, but they want certainty, and those things don't mesh together.
Seems like a contradiction. It does, doesn't it? Yeah.
Well, we'll need to manage the polarity thinking. We had an episode back with Laura Mandela. We talked about polarity thinking. So it's rather than thinking about this either or, it's thinking about as yes and. So what's new and exciting on your horizon? What's got you energized these days, Anne?
Well, I'm starting to really expand some of my toolbox, my data analytic toolbox, and I'm taking on more ways of analyzing more data. Not only, how a lot of the data that we do in our field when we're looking at generational change, a lot of it, 90% of it comes to us in English languages. And I won't say too much, but I'm able to data mine a lot more content that can give us some glimpses about future trends based on far more languages. So that's one of the interesting projects that I'm working on at the moment. Okay.
We know that not everybody's like American youth. People that are in different cultures and different countries are experiencing the world very differently. Their environment is different.
Absolutely. And I think that's very important to keep an eye on, because the fact of the matter too is that this generation is also more globalized, which kind of redefines who you seek your friendships with. So in the past, it might have been easier to form strong and deep friendships with the people who live close to you physically, in physical proximity. With social media, you don't really need to do that anymore. I mean, a kid in London can be best friends with another kid in Sao Paulo if they have the same interest.
Yeah, actually, I see this in my son. He's Gen Z and he has great friends in different countries.
Exactly. And so the ability to understand what other people are experiencing in their environment is also shifting. So I think that it's going to be very important for us to understand how this generation is experiencing their world and the future, regardless of where they live. So this being able to kind of pull together data from many different languages, putting it together and see how it all flows together is very interesting, I think.
Well, I hope that you'll publish it or, come back and share some of that with us. What's one specific action that listeners can take today, tomorrow, this week that can help them ratchet up their own effectiveness as a leader or as a professional based on your research?
I would urge them to think long-term future. Try to envision, what does the future look like? Not based on necessarily only, the trends that you see today, but when you look at many different trends and you put them together, what are the different types of scenarios that you can see? Mm-hmm. Because it's not, even though we can't predict the future, it's very important to have been there mentally within our minds, our brains, because then you can sort of come back to the present and then you have much more vivid understanding about what you have to do today. Instead of me giving sort of an advice, this is how the future is going to look like, so you should do X, Y, Z. I think it's much better that organizations and people go into their own future and go into, make that mind leap into the future and dare thinking about those different scenarios. Because that's how you can figure out what you need to do today so that you can create the best condition for yourself in the future.
I think that it makes sense what you're saying. And I also can see how, listeners know I always put my devil's advocate hat on. Mm-hmm. Some listeners might say, well, I have nothing to base this vision on, from what will I pull to create this future in my head? Where would they go? What would you advise?
Okay, so one technique one can use, take two major uncertainties, take two trends that you're really wondering, it preoccupies your mind a lot. You think about it a lot. And then you put those two trends together and you tend to you think of, if this one trend moves in this one direction and it's combined with this other trend, we might have this sort of scenario. Well, if one of them, so for example, you basically make
a matrix, right?
Yeah. So you can create these different types of scenarios and you look at the confluence of trends coming together. And I think that's how it helps because, for example, take some of these uncertainties around Generation Z. On the one hand, they want the freedom to innovate. We're moving into an ever more individualizing world, right? And at the same time, they need that uncertainty. And we can maybe think of other uncertainties, like, for example, climate change. We don't know what's going to happen. And then you look at these two trends intersecting each other. Then what do we get? Well, perhaps we're getting more Generation Zers wanting to work in safe environments to find some of that safety that they don't feel that they have in a world that is being upended ecologically.
Yeah. Oh, good. This, I think, scenario planning, right? Is that what you call that?
Yes. That's what we call scenario planning.
Okay, good. I'll link to that in the show notes. Well, Anne, thank you so much. How can people stay in touch, learn more from and about you?
So I have a website called afterthemillennials.com, and that's my portal that's where I blog about new trends. That's where I write about where I travel, where I have my presentations, what projects I'm working on. So you can also sign up for a newsletter. I do not spam people.
Thank you so much for spending some time with the Talent Growers today, and I really appreciate your insights. Very interesting topic, and I'm sure that people will continue to follow up and stay in touch with you to learn more about that. Super thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Talent Growers, it's always so fascinating to think about the future and what it will bring, and to talk to someone who does this full-time, studying trends and predicting the future, or forecasting the future. I'm sure she wouldn't want to be seen as predicting. And I really like that suggestion right there at the end, to think about two different potential future scenarios and how they intersect. And again, like I said, we're linking to that in the show notes. So go ahead and take a look over there on the show notes page, which is on the website, talentgrow.com. on the podcast page for this episode. I really appreciate that you've listened, and I hope that you got value. If you did, please share it with one other person. That's the way that the podcast listenership can grow, putting it out there anyway. So we might as well get the most number of people enjoying and benefiting from the work that I'm doing. to help you be the kind of leader people actually want to follow. I'm Halelly Azulay, your leadership development strategist here at TalentGrow, and this has been another episode of the TalentGrow Show. Thanks for listening, and until the next time, make today great.
Thanks for listening to the TalentGrow Show, where we help you develop your talent to become the kind of leader that people want to follow. For more information, visit talentgrow.com.